Everybody, you're very kind to tune in to Sunday School Bonanza. We're grateful that you're with us as we talk about a gospel doctrine lesson and prepare you better for your Sunday. Sunday School Bonanza is a This Week in Mormons production. Please join us at thisweekinmormons.com. Send us an email at contact@thisweekinmormons.com and just join us on various social media outlets, what have you. We love interacting with you and appreciate you taking the time to do it. Now, before we get to this week's lesson, which is lesson number 41, entitled, I have finished my course. We're in 1 Timothy and Titus. We're all over that. I'd like to welcome my co-host for the week. Dustin Homer is back in the house, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be back.
He's been gone for a little while.
In the house.
Dustin's a traveling man, so he's we pin him down when we can. I will literally email Dustin and say, hey, we should record again. Then he'll say, great, I'm going to be overseas. How is it like 7 weeks from now? But we'll make it work.
But because Jeff is such a good friend, he accommodates my
I'm persistent
ridiculous
is what I am. I say,
sincere.
I say, look, if you're not doing this, it's going to be me and my infant son trying to pull this off. And I don't think he's going to have a lot to say.
I don't know. Guy is already clearly an extremely intelligent
I would
man,
say, Guy,
so.
what do you think about personal apostasy? And he's just like, ah! That's what would happen. So,
give him a couple months. He'll be as eloquent as his father.
Oh my goodness, let's hope not. I can't handle that right now. I can only handle one of me. I don't want there to be. I hope he takes on after his mom. She's much more tolerable than I am.
That's true.
Okay, so getting into these epistles, they're sometimes called the Pastoral Epistles. Something I learned in researching this because his epistles to Timothy and Titus differ from a lot of the previous Pauline epistles, namely because Timothy and Titus were associates of Paul. They were colleagues, basically, and Paul was writing directly to them to instruct them. This wasn't necessarily broader instructions to, the Ephesians or the Thessalonians or what have you. To the church, this was to his individual people. So they have a bit of a different tone sometimes and different reminders, and they were facing different issues. I believe Timothy was converted sometime in the early days of Paul and followed him around a lot, actually, on a number of his journeys.
Right.
And he was from modern-day Turkey, Lycaonia is where he was from. Titus was Greek, a Gentile by every measure that we could tell, and was basically later on sort of elevated as a bishop of sorts over Crete, is what we've learned.
Right, and Paul left him there.
And I believe when this was written to Timothy, I think Timothy was actually in Ephesus when these were written to him, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, I think so.
So
it's basically like the apostle writing to his local leaders, giving some, like a very, kind of candid memo.
Well, it's almost like you're writing to like the 70, who's the area authority, and saying, hey.
Yeah.
So I know I wrote to the Ephesians in general.
It's like unvarnished. It's not like the public epistle. It's like, this is our communication about what's really important right now.
Yeah. And so we're covering a lot in this lesson, namely examples of being true believers. Apostasy is a big issue. And then following after righteous pursuits, not sort of losing our sight of the shore. A lot of broad themes, but I find that these epistles have some very potent passages that illustrate what we want to talk about. And I really love that it dives right in on apostasy. Is one of the first things. I mean, you go right there. 1 Timothy chapter 4, famous sections there on apostasy. And missionaries, for many of you who have been missionaries, might remember these are popular ones to quote when trying to explain the great apostasy to investigators or others. And as it says, as now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry. This was very popular in my mission. I served in the Catholic country. Mm-hmm. Forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats, which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. And it goes on and on. These alone are very popular verses. And I used to look at these all the time and be like, dude, forbidding to marry, saying no pork or whatever. It's all right there, guys. It's right there.
Paul said it.
Like Paul said it right there in Timothy. Why is this a discussion?
But I mean, I think it's really useful though, because, oftentimes we think about, I think about apostasy as something that happened a long time ago when the apostles abandoned Joseph Smith, or it's what happened with the great apostasy. Yeah. But apostasy is any time, right, we depart from the core teachings of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Apostasy is something that happens all the time, and it's something that none of us are immune to. And I think that's really important. Like, nobody is immune to apostatizing. It's something we all have to be vigilant of and to make sure that we're very much in line with the Lord's will, very much in line with what his servants are saying, and focusing exclusively on the core principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ, not getting lost on tenets. And that's what Paul is pushing, because that's what the saints were facing then. And honestly, that's what all of us face now too.
And there's a good reference there. First in 2 Timothy in 3:7, when it says, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth.
Yeah.
And I find that is the potential malaise that faces us greatly in our latter days. When in our search for truth, and our search when we have questions, which are fair, and concerns and things that might not settle with us, I think sometimes we can get so wrapped up in that process that we forget about the fundamentals of actually getting a testimony and living the gospel and understanding basic things. I know that's a broad statement. I understand everyone. It's very nuanced. It's very individual.
But that's a great topic for class discussion on this one, right? We have knowledge, but what's the ultimate source of truth? How do we obtain truth? I mean, that's a really powerful point to discuss, I feel like, as part of the context of what Paul's saying.
And not just obtain the truth, but stick with the truth.
Right.
I think I've known countless people who I have seen and known have known the truth. I have not doubted. I know that we all sometimes have doubts or whatever, but I've seen strong people who've had great testimonies fall away for myriad reasons, some of which are genuine doubts, some of which are just pride. You see these things. And I guess that is a question, though, to you, Dustin. Like, what can we do then to combat that? What can we do to not get so wrapped up in ourselves and thinking that we know better at times or what have you, and avoid personal apostasy that can weaken the church and weaken the gospel?
Right.
I mean, what can we actually do to combat that?
Well, I think that's one of the things Paul speaks to in these epistles is the importance of sound doctrine, of like true doctrine, of focusing on true doctrine and avoiding false doctrine. And I think that's actually a really important part of that. I was teaching seminary recently in the Old Testament, right? And you teach the
sweet savor, buddy.
Yeah, teach the beginning of Genesis, and there's some really intense stuff that's pretty hard to get your head around, right? And a lot of ways to interpret some of the different things that are happening around the creation and the early days of the world and so on. And I realized that there's a lot of room in there to give a lot of personal interpretation, to have a lot of speculation. And I actually had to be quite careful to make sure that in the teaching, it's like, listen, there's a lot of different ideas here. This is what the prophets have said, and this is what matters, that God created a world so we had an opportunity to accept the atonement of Jesus Christ and change. And that's what matters, because that's the gospel of Jesus Christ. Atonement, change, opportunity for eternal salvation. That's what we're here, and that's what it's all about. And that is what matters out of everything that we do as Latter-day Saints. And so I think we risk apostasy when we lose sight of that central, fundamental root of our doctrine, which is the atonement of Christ and how we interact with it. And besides that, I mean, nothing really matters. And so I think I've seen that false doctrine is any time we depart too far from focusing on that central, fundamental, prominent part of our entire faith and existence.
Yeah, and that's not to say that going off and exploring things that are more ancillary to what we're doing doesn't have value. It does.
Yeah.
But that can't be what holds us up.
And I would say it has more personal value, perhaps, than collective value, to be quite candid, right? I mean, we can, in our own thinking, we have opportunity to study, think, learn ourselves. But I think when we're, as a church, as a people, there's a reason that we focus on principles, that we focus on fundamentals, that we focus on pure doctrine, scriptures, and the words of the prophets.
And it's funny because I've learned in callings of mine how that's an actual specifically named responsibility in a lot of callings to ensure that pure and correct doctrine is taught.
Yeah.
Like, this is a very important thing in the church that I think we don't always focus on very much. I think we just think about, say good stuff that's true, but how it's like I have a responsibility in my elders quorum. Like, one of the clear things I'm supposed to do is ensure that it's taught. And if untrue doctrines are taught, I have to step in. Thankfully, I don't have to do that. But but many of you in different leadership positions actually have that responsibility to ensure that happens and not shy away from that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And so to be those true believers, as Paul says to Timothy, he wants us to be an example of the believers. And so I feel like that's reasonably self-explanatory. For me, being an example of a believer is somebody who lives what I profess to believe, in my opinion, not simply just saying I believe it, not lip service. And what I like here in the lesson is it goes through a few different ideas or concepts and sort of what we can do to be examples of them in our lives. You can do, if you're teaching the lesson, you can pick and choose. This is a great area for discussion, honestly.
Yeah.
You could fill a whole lesson on just this, on section 2 right here, honestly, if you wanted. I don't know. Are there any of these that jump out at you, Dustin, that you would want to focus on?
Well, in general, I mean, I think that's a great question, right? To lead the discussion, which is, and they have it in the lesson manual here. How have you been influenced by a person who is an example of the believers? And every time I look at the things that they list here, whether it's charity, whether it's examples of faith that I've seen, whether it's examples of people who really can convey the Spirit. I mean, those have had major impacts on me in my life, and have made me a better person. And I think that's a really excellent, I think, prompt from the lesson manual to have a conversation about what have you seen, what examples have people presented to you that have blessed and changed you, and how can we become those types of people for others?
Yeah, I mean, the ones they give here, just so you know, word. And I like conversation, which could also be, conduct, behavior, what have you.
Big, yeah.
Charity, spirit, faith, and purity. And I can all think of various people in my life, and then who've exemplified those things. And I think of myself and wonder which ones I actually do a bit. I think of like making a heat map of my life, right? And which ones are which ones are the strongest and which ones are the weakest, And
your conversation influences me, Joe.
That's nice of you to say, because I think about my conversation, and I think that sometimes I'm way too caustic, and I'm also not patient enough or deliberate, perhaps, in things I say sometimes. Like, that's a personal thing I want to work on. I think of the Savior's example with the condemned woman who was condemned in adultery.
Mm-hmm.
And before the Savior says, let them cast the first stone, there's that part in the scripture when it says that he just kind of like kneels down and just kind of draws in the sand with his finger. And I think I've said this before on the show this year, but I love that because it teaches me so much that Christ was deliberate in what he did. And It's so easy for us to be so easy for us to be reactive and think that we always have to just get in there and say, and I have a great compulsion where I want to get in there with a retort quickly.
Yeah.
But the Lord didn't do that necessarily. He sat there and just thought for a second and knew what he was going to do. And that's just one minor example, but that's something I think about that affects my life, how I want to improve in that area. And, there are a number of other. You can talk about all of these and assess yourself how you're doing with them. People, who clearly live by faith, people who have a great spirit about them is another hard thing sometimes. I think it can be, it's that fine line I find between like you're not doing stuff that's bad necessarily, but you might still do things that drive the spirit away.
Right. Are you really an example of a believer?
Yeah. And that's hard because you can still be a believer, but you might realize I don't have the perfect balance there because not everything you're going to do is a spiritual experience. Like if you're out playing rugby on the weekend, it's not necessarily supposed to be a spiritual experience, and the Spirit might not be with you during that time or anything. Yeah,
but I mean, like we talk about so much your conduct and how you approach every situation. I think, I think that's a great point.
Exactly.
And I would hope that could be, in class, a productive conversation about like how we become better at actually influencing people, right? Not just like, oh yeah, we should be better, but there's this is an action, not just like a state of being.
Well, because we influence by example.
Right, yeah. So like what specific, I like what you said, like what specific attributes do we need to foster so we can actually have an impact on people?
And we impact people best when we are that example, in my opinion. I've known people who have just said things and it's like fine. And then there's those who I've seen who have clearly had any of these attributes as a part of them and lived it. And that's what inspires you to be a better person.
Yeah.
I mean, I can say these things even on the show all I want, but if I'm not living it up, then what's the point, right? So.
Yeah, no, very well said. So, last part goes into following after righteousness, right? And he talks very specifically about what it means, what it takes to deny ungodliness. Talks about money. We all love money.
I do.
But the love of money is indeed the root of all evil, as has been said.
What?
And I think that's a useful, again, very important topic.
I'm a day trader, okay?
And that is the root of all evil. No, and I think that's what's great about this. And there's a great quote from Elder Oaks, and I think a great part of this lesson is being candid about the fact that money in and of itself is not bad because resources can indeed be used to do good. And that's a really important point. But it's also a really important point that most people are inclined to have a love for money and an inclination towards it, and that is often that love, that desire for resources, for having more than another person is often the result of a lot of evil, or the root of a lot of evil, and we have to be pretty careful about that. And
if you do it, you're coveting. And sadly, so much of that is we're victims of our own, marketing and advertising and stuff like that. Like, would I care about this and that, about needing things and wanting money and stuff if it weren't for the onslaught of media telling me I'm supposed to have those things? Probably not, right?
I don't know. I think you would, honestly. I mean,
You
I
think
think
so?
I think that's the thing, is that like, it doesn't matter like what period of time you're in or like what's available or whatever. Like pride and covetousness and all these things are like at the root of human nature, are some of the adversary's most common tools, and are some of the easiest ways to drive us away from thinking about the Lord and thinking about being better people. And so I think that no matter what, I mean, money has always been, or whatever the corollary of money has always been, a really important part of the tool that the adversary uses to hurt us if we love it too much, or it's a tool that we can use to do a lot of good in the world if we want to.
I have sort of a latter day interpretation of this as well. Not that we're talking about contemporary things, but I've seen lately in recent years as the church has sort of branched out more into interesting like real estate for-profit development type things. You got City Creek, you've got the condominiums in Philadelphia, you've got the plans to develop Florida as like a whole city or whatever, right? There's all this stuff. And I myself have experienced some discomfort with some of these things because you feel like, well, what are we doing? Couldn't we better spend that on like charitable endeavors or something like that? But on the flip side, like you said earlier, Dustin, what are we using the money for? And if we're in a position perhaps to greatly augment our increase, does that then get rolled back into positive pursuits? I would assume so, and I would hope so, into stuff that matters. And that's just a good reminder to me that even though if we don't understand everything that like Deseret Holdings LTD is up to, sometimes that does come back around to enable the church to function at a higher level in other capacities. Obviously, I haven't seen the books or anything. I would like to think that money that we've gained from the City Creek endeavor, for example, is actually being rolled back into like general funds for like Bishop's Storehouse and stuff like that. And it would not shock me if that's the case. And so it is a matter of what we choose to do with our money. I've known many wealthy, great people in my day. And I have seen a difference between those who cling to their riches, kind of like the young man who went to the Savior and asked him what he needed to do for salvation. And I've seen those who are wealthy and they're fine with it, but are clearly very charitable and giving and humble with what they have. Ideally, we are like the latter.
Right. And I would just want to say really quick that this idea of the love of money is the root of all evil applies to everybody, right? Because there's the prideful rich and the prideful poor.
Mm-hmm.
I've been pridefully
Good
poor.
point.
You know
Good
what I mean?
point.
I've been kind of like pridefully, covetously poor and wanting more resources, and that has led to negative feelings. And like that's important too. I mean, this applies to everybody. It's not like I'm rich and what do I do with my money? It's like, money, worldly things are a part of everybody's life. They're necessary. But how we treat it and how much we care about it, especially compared to much more important things of eternity, will define a lot of our character.
Exactly. That's a good note to go out on. So I like it. That was good. I like the great stuff here. So if you read, basically you're reading all of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, all for your research. I highly recommend reading all these books. Like a lot of the epistles, they're reasonably short, so you can do it for part of your study. Once again, lesson 41, I have finished my course. Dustin, thank you for coming back and sharing your insights with the class.
Oh, it is my pleasure indeed. Have an excellent Sunday, everybody.
And everyone, as Bill and Ted would say, be excellent to each other. Do you know that reference? I know you hate movies.
I do know it.
Okay.
I do know it indeed.
Good deal. So thanks for listening to Sunday School Bonanza, everybody. We hope you have a great Sunday. And